So hello, Berlin Science Week, and welcome to this session, which we've entitled Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Science Advice. And even if you are afraid to ask, there is one person with me today who is not afraid to answer. My name is Michael Creek, and it's my pleasure to be putting your questions this morning to Professor Rolf-Dieter Heuer. Welcome, Rolf.
Thank you. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, everybody.
Yeah, I'm welcoming you this morning on behalf of SAPEA, so Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. And SAPEA is part of the scientific advice mechanism that supports the European Commission here in Brussels. And we'll be hearing from you, Rolf, a little bit more about how that science advice works in just a moment. But it involves SAPEA bringing together scientific advice, evidence for 7 experts from across Europe, our group of 7 chief scientific advisors. And Rolf, so not only are you one of the 7, you are also the chair of the group, making you the best qualified person to be answering everybody's questions today. And,
I'm not so sure. Okay.
We'll see. But we also know you, of course, as a particle physicist, the former Director General of CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research in Geneva. And that was at a particularly exciting time for CERN, back in 2009 to 2015, during the first run of CERN's Large Hadron Collider, and of course the discovery of the elusive Higgs boson. Thank you very much, Rolf, for making the time to join us today. Really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
How are you this morning?
I'm quite fine, thank you. And actually, I'm presently in Germany, where the lockdown is a little bit less stringent than in France, where I normally live. And that has several personal reasons that I'm now in Germany. But due to the lockdowns, I'm somehow stuck in Germany. But that's okay.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you a bit more about the pandemic. But first, yeah, how are you feeling about answering people's questions this morning?
It depends on the questions.
We'll see what people come up with. I'm curious as well to see what people are going to ask. I'll explain a little bit about how this is going to work. So you might be watching us live on YouTube, on Twitter, or on LinkedIn. Either way, you can comment live on the video with your questions. And you can ask about anything you like. So from questions around science advice to questions about Rolf's life and career or current hot topics in research. We will pick out as many as we can for me to put to Rolf, and we would ask you to keep them short so that we can fit them on the screen. You can also tweet your questions using the hashtag #AskRolf that you can see in the description, and many of you already have been. So let's make a start. So yeah, I wanted to ask you before we start. So life has been very strange for all of us, I think, since the outbreak of COVID-19. I wanted to ask, yeah, you mentioned a little bit about how things are different for you. How has your life changed?
Well, it has changed in the way that I'm sitting in front of a rectangular screen most of the time, which normally does not happen. And normally I'm traveling a lot because the personal meetings cannot be replaced by anything else. Videos are fine. You can do that as we do it now. But one needs the personal contact. One needs, in conferences, the coffee breaks where you can look at somebody and tell, okay, let's have a private coffee because we want to discuss something. And in these private discussions, you can, well, I would say, achieve much more than in the official discussions.
Yeah,
that's what I'm missing, and I'm pretty sure, especially the young people, will also miss that. So that the only video should not become our daily life, but now it saves our daily life, so to speak, our daily scientific life. Okay.
Yeah, and I see we have questions coming in, but I also wanted to ask a little bit about the pandemic and what this pandemic has shown us about the relationship between science, policy, and the public.
But sorry, I was distracted by the question popping up.
Can you repeat? Yeah, I wanted to ask, with COVID-19 in mind, it's really highlighted something interesting about this relationship between science, the public, and policy. What are your thoughts about it?
I think it has shown first of all, that there are many more scientists than I personally thought of, who are willing and able to explain to the public what's on stake and what's going on. Of course, it also shows how science works to the general public, but you have to give already a sort of answer with a lot of uncertainty, and you have to explain the uncertainty. You have to tell people that we are still missing things, and then of course the knowledge improves, evidence increases, and then also the measures might change, and this is all which you have to explain to people, so that people understand that things are developing in a natural way. The more you know, the more you can explain. And I think that's if you want to find something positive in this pandemic, then it is the fact of the interaction between the general public, politicians, and the scientists. But scientists have always to keep in mind that they have to explain things. Yeah. And also to listen to the questions of the general public and to try to answer them in a consistent way if possible, although there are diverging views, which is also natural.
Yeah, that challenge of dealing with all this uncertainty and complexity.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm sure we will have some more questions about this coming up in this hour. But yeah, let's go to this question from Susanna on Twitter. So she asks, democracy is all about debate, but scientific evidence is sometimes presented as non-debatable. How do you reconcile those two views as a scientific advisor? It's a good question.
That's a good question. I think the first answer is science is not democratic. Science itself is based on theory and experiment. And the experimental results, together with the interpretation or explanation by theory, tells you what is the evidence. What is debatable is the interpretation of the evidence. Yeah, and that's where very often one has diverging views, because you can interpret things in a different way depending on how you weigh I'm coming back to the uncertainties. It depends on how you weigh these uncertainties. That you can debate, but the evidence itself, not, because science is not democratic.
Right. Yeah. Politicians often like to say, "Oh, we're acting according to the science."
Yes, that's correct. That they should do. Yes. But again, I think our discussion at the moment is centered around the word uncertainty or missing knowledge gaps. Yes, they act according, well, if they do it like this, then they act according the scientific evidence. But I'm coming back to what I said before. The scientific evidence can change when you have more information. At the beginning, you have not many data, and you have to base your evidence on the results which you derive from a small amount of data. The more data you have, the better your knowledge, and this might change the way you have to go, and that might change also the evidence. It's quite normal.
Absolutely. Okay, so you have another question coming in from Mangala. She says, hi. She's the outgoing chair of the Young Academy of Europe. She says, thank you for this opportunity. And can you comment on what you see as the role of young academics in SAPEA, and how can they be involved? So SAPEA, of course, being part of the
your side of the business, yes. The role of young academics in SAPEA is vital. We are trying to involve, or SAPEA tries to involve all the time in the evidence gathering, also young scientists, the young academies. And they play also a role in the group of chief scientific advisors. I think 2 of our advisors are from young academies. So 2 out of 7 is a good number. So because you have to balance a little bit the experience you need. Well, white hair guys sometimes with experience, but you need the young people because it's for them. Politics, the decisions of policy of politicians is not for yesterday, it's for tomorrow. And the young people are the tomorrow.
So yeah, a lot of your work is very forward-looking, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't think you should do policy regulations backward-looking. You have to look forward. You should look backward in order to try to learn lessons. Yeah, you should not ignore the past. You should build on that. But what comes out should be forward-looking. Yes.
Okay, another question that's coming here on Twitter. This links a bit back to what we were talking about before. This person asks, how can a polarized political context affect social trust in scientific experts?
I think a polarized political context affects everything, not only the social trust in scientific experts. I think the only way I can see to counter that is that you stay away from politics anyhow. Scientific experts should not do politics. They should help politicians, but they should not do it. Yeah, they are not, to my mind, also not. They don't have the mandate to do it, and maybe some of them, including me, are not qualified to do politics. So the political decisions have to come from politicians. The scientists should stay away from that and just give recommendations. If the polarization in politics waters these recommendations or ignores these recommendations, then I think it's up to the scientists to explain who did water down the things. Yeah? Not in a defensive way, but in a natural, normal statement.
Right, and a related question, comment here from Ojo Rojo, who says, if science is not democratic, then you should separate it from the state. And this is interesting, right? Because, yeah, as you say, we have to keep science away, but at the same time, the scientific advice mechanism is housed within the European Commission, and you're working very closely.
Yes, we are working very closely but we are independent. We are completely independent. We are not employed by the European Commission. That's the big difference to other institutions. We are completely, free. Yeah, we are not free in the choice necessarily of the topics we are working on, but we are free in how we work on it, and of course, absolutely free. Only responsible to the scientific evidence, not to any politician.
So how do we ensure that freedom? Yeah.
I'm coming back to that. But he says separate from the state. Yes. But at the same time, you have to connect to the state, to the politicians. Because, frankly speaking, the language is different. Also, the language of social scientists and the language of natural scientists, etc., they are already different. But also the language of politicians and the general public and scientists is also different. You use different words. You interpret differently the meaning of the words very often. So what you have to do is you have to understand what the politicians want, and the politicians have to understand what we can deliver as scientists. So this you have, in that sense, you have to connect, but keep your independence. Yeah. And that's what we are doing. Keeping the independence also means that we decide on experts. We decide on who is tackling which question. We decide at the end what the evidence tells us and what our recommendations are. We present these things then to the politicians and also to stakeholders beforehand. But the main thing is that we only correct whatever, if there are any factual mistakes. We don't change anything on our recommendations. So in this way, we keep complete independence.
And so for me as a European citizen, how do I know that the 7 chief scientific advisors to the European Commission truly are independent? I mean, of course, you will all say you are.
Yes, you have to trust us. No, jokes aside. We have, you can, I think it's even it's on the web. We have declared any possible conflict of interest. And we 7 keep a very close eye on ourselves, that we don't have any touch of a conflict of interest, any sign. In addition, what helps us also in our independence is that we have SAPEA. Because this is, to my mind, one of the biggest advantages of the scientific advice mechanism is to have these 2 layers. One layer is SAPEA. SAPEA comprises more than 100 academies all over the world, mainly from Europe. And so we have access to scientists from more than 100 academies. And they provide the evidence. They do literature research, workshops, we participate in these, but it's the responsibility of SAPEA to produce the evidence report. And we, the 7, we synthesize the evidence. We look at it. We take out of this evidence, we take our recommendations. So sometimes there are conflicts of interest because people from industry are involved in making recommendations to politicians. In our case, we can easily use people from industry because there's a lot of knowledge. You should not leave that knowledge out of all your evidence gathering. However, that's in the stage of SAPEA. Yeah, so SAPEA looks already there on possible conflicts of interest, but we are then step further and look even more on that and do it in an independent, synthesizing or judging way. Okay.
Okay, so this combination of these 2 parts of the scientific advice mechanism, it works well.
It works well. I think that's the key to success and the key to avoid conflicts of interest.
Okay, interesting question here from Brian Cahill on YouTube. Brian asks, would research culture benefit from science becoming more democratic?
I don't think you can make science democratic. I don't know what Brian understands on science becoming more democratic. Science is democratic in the sense that everybody can raise the voice, everybody can participate, but the evidence, the result, cannot be democratic. Take physics. I mean, physics is the same everywhere, independent on in which state you are living in, independent on what continent, independent if you are on the moon or wherever. Physics is everywhere the same. And the evidence out of physics, the results from physics, the rules, the laws of physics, they are not democratic. Yeah.
Although a lot of the topics you're working on related to social sciences do vary greatly from country to country, from region to region.
Yes, but that is not that's not what I consider as democratic. the results of social science, the findings of social science depend on the region, the core. But that doesn't mean that it's democratic, because the results are as they are.
How then can we bridge this gap between research and society? How can we engage people, European people, in this research and policy process?
Well, there are sometimes sort of town meetings. You can of course ask people what is for you the most pressing question, and which one should one tackle first, etc. How do you want to do that? But that doesn't mean that the people have an influence on the outcome on the result. Yeah, the democracy you can. I guess that's maybe what Brian was referring to. The democracy you can have in the discussion on how to get there. Yeah. Now he says he means whether researchers should engage with politics rather than staying completely separate. That's correct. That one should do. Because one has to, as I said before, one has to understand what the politicians want and what the politicians need. Sometimes you can get a question from politicians which is scientifically unanswerable. Then you have to discuss with the politicians, what do you mean? What do you want? And so you have to keep the politicians in the loop, because sometimes you work how long do we work on an opinion? 6 months, 1 year. Things evolve during that time. And therefore also the question might slightly change, or at least might find a different turn on it. And this you have to keep in mind. And so, yes, you should keep a loose connection. Let's call it this way, a loose connection without being influenced from one side or from the other.
And when you say to work on an opinion, what is an opinion in this sense?
An opinion is a paper which we publish where we have recommendations in. And that paper is based on the evidence review prepared by SAPEA. So the first step is SAPEA, and the second step then is our opinion.
Okay. All right. A question again from YouTube. Thank you for your question, Darude. This person asks, how do you reconcile absolute recommendations? So they give an example of a flood dam ought to be 1 meter tall, warming must be kept below 2 degrees. How do you reconcile these absolute recommendations with necessary political compromise? For example, it will cost too much, let's make it shorter.
Well, the first part, is our part. It's a part of the scientists. We make the recommendation. And once we make a recommendation, let's say of the 1 meter, then there is a lot of scientific evidence behind it. Yeah. In this case, I think it's quite obvious. You can calculate how much the water level would rise, etc. Under certain conditions. And there you have already something. It cannot be absolute, because you always have to assume certain conditions, and the conditions might change. Even if there's a lot of wind, etc., then you have certainly a safety margin also. The second part of the question is the responsibility of the politicians, because we are only one aspect of the decision making for politicians. There are other aspects. There are values, there are beliefs, there are opinions. There is money, or the missing money, whatever you want to take, and they have to weigh the different aspects in the way they think is best for the society at this moment. That's at least in theory what they should do.
And what have been some examples from your work then, from your recommendations, your absolute recommendations to the Commission, where they have been implemented in a compromised way. I'm curious about how that has worked in the past.
Well, this is more tricky than to give examples because the European Commission usually can only also give some recommendations that in the regulations propose something. They can make proposals in the regulations or in laws, etc. But the execution, the implementation is then up to the individual states. And that's the complications in the European Commission. Yeah, they don't determine so much. They, as far as I can see, they give a lot of proposals, but to implement these proposals is not necessarily always the same in the different states. So in that sense, I'm against absolute recommendations. I'm against the word absolute recommendations.
Okay. Let's move on to this question from Cindy Morris. Thanks, Cindy, for your question. She's on YouTube and she asks, how to make inroads towards policies on subjects that are highly interdisciplinary, founded on multiple concepts. Okay, and I think this is relevant to a lot of the work that you've been doing over the years. She says, yeah, the big challenges are this interdisciplinarity. How can we improve these interdisciplinary discussions?
Well, actually, we have social scientists, for example, in the group of 7, and it's absolutely clear you should work as interdisciplinary as possible. This is also what we in our papers very often state. It has to be interdisciplinary, not at the end, and not as a word, but as a living the interdisciplinarity. Frankly speaking, it changes a lot when you discuss with social scientists as a natural scientist. And I know it's the same for the social scientists when they discuss with natural scientists. It takes more discussions. In that sense, we are coming back to the democracy because it's an open discussion in a democratic way. That means it's not like this between the two, but it's like this. On equal eyesight. It's absolutely important because you have to fold in the social part as well as the natural science part. And I can tell you from my experience in that group, you can only win by this.
What's a good example from the work you've done, the topics you've covered, which have been particularly interdisciplinary?
Already on cybersecurity, one of our first papers, we had many discussions taking into account social science. What do people want? To take into account what are the concerns of the people? This you would not do as a natural, well, sometimes you do, but normally you would not fold in so much social science into cybersecurity as a natural scientist. And now in our forthcoming recommendations on pandemic preparedness and management, which should come out in a few days, we really point out how important the interdisciplinarity is, the multidisciplinarity, to take everything into account. Yeah, all types. I think, and that's again the charm of the scientific advice mechanism, and in that case, the charm of SAPEA. We can take the scientists, the academicians from everywhere, from all types of science, and this is how you derive the best evidence from different view angles.
Great. Okay, here's a question from Rosemarie Catherine Neumann on YouTube. Thank you for your question. She asks, what is your top advice to connect to someone with another conflicting opinion? So whether that's a politician, a member of the public, a lobbyist, and what role does active listening play in this? Can you give some personal examples? course. I'm sure you must have come across plenty of people who disagree with you.
Well, in the scientific advice, in the way we are working, I don't remember that we had really very strongly conflicting opinions, because we could always prove that what we recommend or what we recommended was based on solid, transparent scientific evidence. Yeah. And what is important here to discuss with people is the transparency. That means whatever we use as input from science is publicly available. So we are not taking private communication from A, private communication from B. No, it has to be all publicly available. And that, of course, helps to explain to people and to argue with people on conflicting opinions. It does not work if you have to discuss with people who come to you and say, I have a theory. You have to prove that this is not correct. And these people you cannot convince. You can try, but usually it doesn't work. But what you should do when you have people questioning, even if you think the question is not up to what you would have expected, take it serious and discuss seriously with these people. So she asks, what role does active listening play? A very strong one. Because if you don't listen, you cannot and should not expect that others are listening to you.
Okay. Yeah, and sometimes these opinions can really diverge. People's mistrust in the science. I remember when the Large Hadron Collider started its first run, people were scared that black holes would be created. How do you talk to somebody like this?
Well, we had set up a group of people who answered all the questions with arguments. Yeah, we took each question seriously. And we also produced different papers. We produced a highly scientific, a very detailed scientific paper only for the experts. Then boiled it down to a shorter paper for the scientific community and boiled this even down further for the layman. And that helped a lot. Okay. Yeah, but taking the questions serious. Okay.
Important is respect.
And respect, and that helped, as I said, a lot, especially in this black hole business. Yes.
I'm sure. Okay, let's come to this question from Ilya Bonnet on Twitter. Thank you for your question. Ilya asks, nowadays research should produce just so-called innovations, whatever that means. How can basic research be strengthened in times of simple expectations? Okay.
Thank you, Ilya, for this question. Basic science has to argue all the time that real breakthroughs are usually coming through basic science. What is basic science? Well, first of all, to my mind, there's only science. Yeah? And there is, to my mind, a virtuous circle. You have basic science. This is blue sky science. The only outcome you expect there is new results, new evidence. Okay, out of this, then comes technology and applied science. And with the applied science, you improve the technologies. And with the improved technologies, you improve your basic science. And then the circle starts again. If you break that circle anywhere, it takes not too long that science is lost, because you are missing one very strong part of the circle. And the discovery of this Higgs boson, it took nearly 50 years to find that boson. But why did it take so long? Because we didn't have the technologies. So the technologies had to be developed, and that took several virtuous circles until we had it. And that's maybe one of the telling examples. It takes a long time. There is a famous, I don't know, is it a joke or was it true, from Michael Faraday, who 2 centuries ago worked on electricity. And he was once visited by his finance minister, I think. And the usual question, of course, is, it's fantastic what you are doing, but how can I use it? And then Faraday answered very honestly, well, sir, I have no idea, but maybe one day you can tax it. And that was correct. Yeah. So
sure enough.
You have to make clear that things are taking time and that breakthroughs, the so-called Sprunginnovation in German, they come out of unforeseen results in usually basic science.
Okay, so no innovation without basic science. That seems to be.
I'm a scientist from basic science, so this is what I have to say.
They're asking the right person. Okay, here's a question from the S4D4C project. I think this is a project about science for democracy or diplomacy. They ask, what are important perspectives when science advice links with science diplomacy? How is the work in SAPER and the Scientific Advice Mechanism Group influencing international relations? And, it's a lot of questions, how is it influenced by foreign policy?
Yeah, but I think here one mixes a few things. Normally, foreign policy is not something where we are influenced by or which we are influencing. What we tried to do, and where we had some success, was to go beyond the boundaries of Europe. That means we have taken very good connections with Canada on a few subjects, like on the question of microplastics, and everybody is. Science doesn't stop at the borders, and also the problems which you want to tackle with scientific advice, etc., is not stopping at borders. However, our mandate, of course, is to do it mainly with a focus on Europe. What the European Commission can do and what is in the mandate of the European Commission. Nonetheless, we decided to go beyond Europe because, especially on the plastics, on the microplastics, nanoplastics, it's a problem which affects everybody, and which also went up even into a meeting of the G20 and the G7. But this is only one example where I wouldn't use the word influence, but where we are working in more internationalism than only Europe. We also take very often scientists from outside Europe to help us. I mean, in SAPER, for example, you are taking people from countries outside Europe in the working groups, because why are we doing that? The answer is simple. There's a lot of knowledge everywhere, not only in Europe, and we should try to take the best scientific experts.
That's it. So gathering the evidence at global level to make recommendations at European level, which then, of course, have this international impact.
Yeah. But what concerns science diplomacy, we are trying to do this through some of the institutions, but this is outside the remit of some, outside the science advice. These are two different things. But science diplomacy is something which is very close to my heart, because CERN, for example, It was found in 1954, and that was science diplomacy at that time, and it's still science diplomacy today, because there are countries who normally don't talk too much with each other, but the scientists from these countries are working at CERN. And we have another facility in Jordan, which is called Sesame. This is synchrotron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East, where scientists from several countries like Iran, Palestine, Egypt, Cyprus, Turkey, and Israel are working together. It's a fantastic mix, and it works.
Okay.
So science can contribute to diplomacy. However, I can tell you, it takes much longer than Heuer hopes.
I can believe it. Let's come to this question from Michelle Fox on YouTube. She's asking, should scientists develop a scientists' lobby? So political changes, for example, solutions against climate change, can finally be executed.
I wouldn't call it scientist lobby, because lobbying has it should have a different word, because lobbying has always some negative touch, at least in my understanding. To some extent, it is there. There is a large group, there is a large institution which presents all the data. It's a worldwide. I'm missing the name at the moment. Do you remember how it's called on the climate change?
The IPCC.
The IPCC. Thank you. Yeah, the International Panel on Climate Change, I think, is IPCC standing for. So it exists. The problem is, how can you make it without influence from politics? Because as soon as politics mingles in, you have a problem. So exactly there, we have the problem of the too close, of being too close together, politics and scientists. And so ideally what you would need is to create an international institution which is financed by the countries, but independent in its work. Of course, you have to have an oversight body, but it should not be influenced by the stakeholders. It should not be influenced by those who pay for this institute. Because as soon as you are influenced by those who support you, you lost your independence.
Right.
So if you want to create a scientist lobby, let's call it like this, nonetheless, you have to guarantee the independence and at the same time the funding.
So not a lobby in the sense that there is a political objective in mind,
yeah.
But I suppose, yeah,
only a science agenda should be there.
Right. Okay. Let's come to this question from Peritia on Twitter. They ask, what matters most to trust a science advisor? And is it different for citizens compared to policymakers? Great question.
What matters most to trust a science advisor? As I said, independence and transparency. And both together, I would say, is the openness. Yeah. The science advisor has to be absolutely open, absolutely transparent in what they are doing. Everything has to be, you have to be able to follow things, and you have to explain the step from science to science advice, and to try to make it as clear as possible. And once you have this, then you can establish trust. But this is a seesaw mechanism. To establish trust takes some time, long time. To lose the trust is very quickly. And then you have to establish it again. So you have to establish the trust, and you have to take care that you don't lose it. Then
And
you are there.
Is that the same for policymakers and citizens alike?
Well, politicians are also citizens. That's my answer here. I think it is like this. Now, politicians, but that's not a question of the trust. Politicians, of course, have a different agenda usually to citizens. So as soon as this agenda plays in, there's a different take on the scientists. But I would not say that this necessarily influences the trust in that sense. Because, I hope at least.
Yeah, the policymakers that you're advising are the European commissioners. And yeah, there's 27 of them. They're each individuals with their own values, their own beliefs. It must be a challenge to build this trust with each of those individually.
Well, we have to build trust, especially with the ones who come to us and want to have a question answered, because in 1 year they have to make a regulation on something or so. And the main thing is we are attached to the commissioner for research, etc. That's a long title, but at least the research is in that title. And the main thing is, excuse me, to establish the trust there, because she, the commissioner, will transport this trust into the college of commissioners. And then the commissioners, some of them come to us, have a topic to be dealt with, and then you can build up the trust there, and then with the next ones, etc., etc.
Okay, let's come to this question from Rhoda Jennings. Thanks, Rhoda, for your question. Rhoda says, you mentioned that the legislature, whether EU or member states, may not implement your recommendations for many reasons. How do you manage this, and does it impact on how you present future information? I know the group of chief scientific advisors, you've released a report not so long ago on looking back at the advice you've given and how it has been implemented. Yeah, how do you manage this?
Well, on the last question, no, it does not impact on how we present our future information, because then we would be already no longer independent, because we would react on the reaction of the politicians.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, clearly no. They may not implement our recommendations. Well, very often they don't, because some of our recommendations we know are a bit going far. Like we wanted to on the GMO. The GMO directive is out of, to our mind, is out of date, and one has to do a new one. But they didn't want to touch that. But it's quite obvious that, and we knew it from the very beginning, that we can be happy if some of the recommendations are taken in the regulations or have some consequences also for future research or for future policy relations, etc. You cannot expect that all the recommendations are taken, because if all the recommendations would be taken, we would essentially play the role of the politicians.
Right.
Yeah. So again, you have to get used to the fact, as a scientific advisor, that there are many other aspects which the politicians have to look at and which they have to put into balance, like the beliefs, like public opinions, like conflicting interests, etc., etc. All these things. And after all, they usually want to be re-elected. Okay, so all this balance they put in. So we are happy once some of our recommendations are taken, which they are, or are at least mentioned that they go in the same directions as the regulation wants.
Okay, and a very related question here from Guilherme on Twitter. Guilherme says, a talk yesterday discussed that politics many times have hidden agendas, while science doesn't. It has values and an agenda, yes, but a transparent one. Are we failing to show that to citizens?
Well, if you ask this question, then I can only answer yes. I don't think we are failing. I mean, maybe not enough scientists are explaining this to the general public, because scientists want to talk about their science naturally. They want to show what they did and how they did it, even in languages which is easily understandable. Usually they stay away from these hidden agendas and the values. But one of the points I was always making when I was Director General of CERN, and now I am the president of the Sesame Council, that's the group of the stakeholders, I always pointed out that science diplomacy is only possible because science has no hidden agenda. However, many more people must do that. So in that sense, maybe we are failing. But so that means, I don't know, everybody who is listening, who is interested in science and possibly science diplomacy, etc., please tell this, that science has only one agenda, and that is knowledge gain.
Okay, so we have some work to do.
You have to do some work, yes.
Yeah, definitely. A question here, and yeah, we have 9 minutes left, so please keep your questions coming. We'll try and get as many in as we can. Christian Wolf-Suzuki asks, how do you see the role of science managers? What can they do to help to transfer scientific expertise from an interdisciplinary research context into politics? Who are science managers, first of all?
Well, I guess science managers are directors of large institutions, for example. They are directors or presidents of universities. I think it's part of their daily life that they have to do this. Yeah. First of all, if you are not a very focused laboratory, you always deal with interdisciplinary research. But even the ones who are focused should see the beauty of interdisciplinary research. And this is something they transport essentially every day also to the politicians. Usually you transport it to the research ministers. Here maybe one has to go further, because the research minister also depends on the money from the finance minister, which the finance minister gives him or her. So one should address it to all politicians, to all ministers. And this is what I know what many institutions are doing. And we at CERN did it very regularly with all types of ministers, up to the prime ministers or kings, etc. And I don't know how much it worked, how much it helped, but at least the day they left, they were full of joy. And then, okay.
Here's a question from Alea on Twitter. They ask, how comfortable do you feel about providing science advice on topics that are not always within your scientific expertise? This is true, right? You're a particle physicist. So yeah. I don't know how often your personal research has come in handy in giving science advice on topics.
I can definitely tell you that in none of our papers I had any type of conflict of interest, because particle physics does not play a role there. But that doesn't mean that you have to feel uncomfortable. Otherwise, I would not have taken on this role nearly 5 years ago. What you have to do, what you have to be able as a scientific advisor is to judge what evidence is put in front of you. You have to be able to find out which one is solid, which one is less solid. Where has Sapea missed something? Sorry to say that. Where has Sapea overestimated something, or whatever?
That must be such a challenge in a topic that is not at all your domain. These very complex areas.
It is to some extent difficult if you do it alone. If I would do it alone, I would have some problems. But if you are 7, and 7 is a very nice number, you can discuss very openly for long or for short, and at the end, you find the right way. Yeah? Because you look on it from very different angles, and you come to the same conclusion. This is like in a committee where you have to select somebody, and for a certain post, the people ask the different questions, and they all come usually to the same opinion. Very often, at least in our case.
Okay, and a question that's coming from Esther Hercos from Eurecat in Barcelona. Esther asks, now with coronavirus, many scientists say that politicians should be scientists. So politicians need to be experts in public health, for instance. What would you say to those people?
Exactly what I said now. They don't have to be experts in public health. They don't have to be experts in science. They have to be experts in gauging things, in judging things. They have to be fast thinkers to be able to check what is presented to them, to synthesize and to come to a conclusion. There they have to be experts.
Okay. So yeah,
but not in the topic itself. For this, they have their experts, like the scientists.
Great. And question, yeah, it's good to move fast through these. There's so many to answer within the hour. Samantha Johanna asks, you mentioned unanswerable questions posed to science by politicians. So the questions that science doesn't manage to answer, that politicians are asking. Do you have any particular examples in mind?
I don't have an example in front of me, but what I meant is the formulation of the question. Because it had too many politics in, which is not answerable by science. If you slightly rephrase the question, check it with the politicians, is this what you meant? And the answer is yes, you are there. If the answer is no, then they have to reformulate the question and we work again on it. We are not changing the thrust of the question. We are changing the way we can interpret and therefore then also answer the question. This is what I meant with unanswerable.
Okay, so getting that dialogue right to make sure that politicians have reasonable expectations of what.
Yes.
What can do. Yeah. Okay, a question, I think this is from Twitter, from Sophie. Sophie asks, what are the best ways to bring civil society on board the scientific advice process in a meaningful way? Who do we mean by civil society, first of all?
I would guess, in that case, civil society is something like the general public.
Sure, organizations representing particular
organizations, exactly. Now, we have all the time, before we publish our recommendations, we inform these stakeholders what our findings are and what the recommendations are. So they can have a say and they can also question things. And if they question things in such a way that we are basing some recommendation or a recommendation on the wrong interpretation of the evidence or on a wrong formulation, then we can change these things, but not a recommendation per se.
Okay, so there is some movement.
There is some dialogue, yeah, at the very end of the process, because exactly what Sophie most probably wants is the buy-in of civil society.
Right, building that relationship.
Yes.
Ooh, let's squeeze in one last question from Michelle Fox. Michelle asks, how do you fight against disinformation? So politicians often have the same level of knowledge as regular citizens and use the same media, social media, and news articles. Are they affected in the same way by disinformation? I
would guess so. To some extent, at least, they also have their advisors on this misinformation. But the only way is to present the facts in a clear and understandable way. And a good politician listens and understands. We had a question much earlier about the polarization. There, of course, exist other poles which don't want to hear that. And then you have to continue arguing. And I think the best way to argue there would be to ask them to explain. Don't try to convince people. First, ask the people to convince you. And ask questions. Don't counter necessarily the argument. Ask questions. And then you can see how deep you can go.
Okay, so being curious, listening, engaging.
Exactly. Yeah. We had the listening before. Listen, ask questions, and then you see how much they know.
Okay. Well, this has been a perfect example, I think. We've talked about the importance of entering into dialogue and asking questions, answering questions. I think you've done a fantastic job within this short space of time. Thank you very much, Rolf, for answering all these questions and engaging in conversation so nicely with us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions, to everybody who asked questions.
Yeah, we really appreciate all the comments and questions you've sent, and we see that there's some lively conversations going on in the comments as well, and I hope those conversations can keep going. Of course, this discussion will be hosted on YouTube and will stay there, so the conversations can continue. We hope very much that you'll keep talking. So I also want to say that if you've enjoyed this event, we also have a podcast which presents short interviews on hot topics related to science and science advice. So you can subscribe to that for free, of course, over at sapea.info/podcast. You'll also find a very nice podcast there with Rolf Heuer and your colleague Pearl Dijkstra, which goes into some other aspects of science advice. And it remains for me to say, please enjoy the rest of the Science Week and do keep an eye on our website for upcoming events there too. And we hope to see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.